I want to preface all of this by saying that we try to practice what we preach in terms of practicing transparency, inclusion, and active learning. But given that this is only a 90-minute presentation, we'll do what we can, but we are going to be doing a fair amount of talking at you. So my apologies for that. Sheena, next slide. So we have a lot to cover. We could easily spend hours on many of the topics that we'll be raising, and we do want to leave time for conversation. One of the things that we'll be advocating for in this presentation is the word that I just used, transparency. So I want to model that here by telling you what we'll be doing in the next 90 minutes and why. We'll begin by introducing our community agreements, and then later in the presentation, we'll talk about why they're so important to have in our classes, especially at this time. We'll give a broad overview of what motivates Gen Z, their characteristics, behaviors, and expectations, so you understand why they are the way they are, with the proviso that everything we say about Gen Z is, of course, a generalization. And of course, individuals within this generation have their own motivations, characteristics, behaviors, and expectations. Then we'll talk about one of the key factors that affects their learning, multitasking, because it's important that we directly address with our students the issues of smartphone use, technology, and stress to help them understand how those affect their learning. And just to reiterate, this is me being transparent, telling you what we're going to do and why we're going to do it. We'll transition to inclusive teaching practices because while we should always be practicing inclusion and anti-racism, in this historic moment, we must. Then we'll introduce fairly quickly some high-level approaches to pedagogy that you might actually practice, but might not know what they're called, so that you can be more intentional about your teaching. Because as we move to truly online teaching, it's essential to be intentional about constructing opportunities for students to learn, to explain to them why you're doing what you're doing and what you hope they will get out of it. Then we have a couple of moments, as I said, built in to invite you to share so that we're not exclusively talking at you. And we'll end with strategies to help support students in this very difficult time. And now, Sheena?
Okay, so we'll start by just talking a little bit about community agreements with the understanding that this is a great thing to do, especially right now at the beginning of your class, just to create community and get everyone on the same page. So first, I'll go through the community agreements you see on the slide. We will speak using I language, so we won't speak on behalf of everyone, we'll speak for ourselves. We will criticize ideas and not people. This one is really useful if you have a student who maybe says something offensive or something inappropriate. You can help your classroom and the other students to talk about what was wrong with what was said instead of attacking the person who said it. We will back our opinions with facts and reasoning. And of course, there's going to be emotion, but when we're talking about things that we think, we're going to try to come from a place of reality and not bias or anything else. We will practice active listening, so we'll pay attention to each other. And I mean, I think active listening is a little different on Zoom than it is in person. I haven't quite figured out how, but the important thing is that we're paying attention and listening. And not just talking over each other. We will speak with fairness and call out bias, exclusion, prejudice. This, I think, is something that can be really challenging to do in the classroom, but it's more and more and more important that you do it. The students are really relying on you to speak up. We will move up. And this means, maybe you're someone who doesn't speak up a lot, so you could move up your speaking, or if you do already tend to contribute a lot, maybe you'll move up your listening. This is really just about making sure everyone's voice gets included. And then the last statement, this classroom is a brave space where we are willing to be uncomfortable in order to learn. Having a statement like that on your syllabus can go really far in building trust with your students and making them all commit to understanding, okay, this might not always be easy, but we're going to deal with the tough stuff. I think, you know, given the current climate, yeah, these community agreements are just a really good starting point to start your class with and come back to when things get tricky. Community agreements are a wise tool to use in general when working with people, and especially Gen Z with their diversity and social justice concerns. Again, this tool can help to establish an inclusive and supportive learning environment and can be returned to when the dynamic of the class gets heated or challenging. And in an online space, this is really, really valuable. You know, you can make a section in your Canvas where the community agreements live, and you can change them as you need to and add to them. It's just really important that you focus on what the classroom climate is like, because that really impacts student learning. So next is generational motivators.
So as we think about this generation, it's important to remember some of the traumatic global events they've lived through. There's a general feeling with Gen Z that, quote, things are done to me, I have no control. This leads to increased stress and anxiety. And then the constant social media use can cause this generation to compare themselves to others and feel that everyone else is having a perfect and thrilling life while I'm just an utter failure. As I was reviewing this slide, I was thinking about this moment and the protests and wondering if for young people, this will be a moment of empowerment and assertion of control. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out in the classroom in the fall. And if this younger generation is finding their voice. So that's why the community agreements is so important, because we know issues are going to come up. And if you've established them from the beginning, it's going to be a lot easier to handle issues, because you go right back to them and say, just want to remind ourselves, we said, we will speak from I, we will actively listen, we will. So I think they're going to become very, very important. And then in terms of, next slide, generational characteristics. As I was thinking, preparing this presentation, I started to think that this generation is just a mass of contradictions. They want freedom of choice, but they want, quote, adults to make decisions. They want diversity, but only certain kinds. They want their friends to put down their phones, but they can't put down their own. They're intellectually more mature and emotionally more immature than prior generations. They're on social media all the time, but they never socialize. They have extended childhoods, but were always structured or hovered over by helicopter and now snowplow parents. They're the most racially diverse generation in the United States. 48% identify as a race other than white. If I remember right, over 30% of people under 21 identify as non-binary. 59% say they have friends of different sexual orientations. They've been protected and often allowed to explore alternate identities. Their parents raised them with non-gendered toys. They allowed, quote, boys to wear nail polish and makeup, and essentially allowed them to just be children, except they weren't. Very few experienced unstructured play away from adult supervision, and that's at a huge cost. We've learned that unstructured play and play in the absence of adults is essential to development of creativity, problem solving, and socialization. Helicopter parents hovered. Snow plows clear the path of all obstacles so they don't encounter failure, frustration, or lost opportunities. Childhood has been extended, adolescence starts and ends later, and they want to defer, quote, adulting. Stereotypical adolescent behaviors are way down in terms of, like, could I ask, I am being unable to, there we go, thank you. Stereotypical adolescent behaviors such as alcohol, drugs, adolescent sex are way down, and they spend a lot more time with their parents and online. And when they enter college, they're often exploring the behaviors once they leave home, and they don't have the emotional or social maturity to deal with the experiences. Rachel?
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. Other behaviors that we're seeing in Gen Z, over 30% of them check their phones 30 times or more in an hour. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of us are doing that these days as well. So you can imagine just how much more it's like an appendage for them. They prefer to learn equally from books as they do from YouTube. 59% of them prefer to learn on YouTube. And 47% of them spend 3 or more hours a day on YouTube, with more than half of them saying YouTube has contributed to their education. All of this receptive intake of media and lack of time actually socializing, as Rita was mentioning before, leads to less opportunity for this generation to develop social skills, read the cues of body language, practice eye contact, notice tone of voice. They have less lifetime experience with responsive social situations, and this can impact their ability to resolve challenges, be more proactive, manage conflicts, tolerate failure, and build empathy for themselves and others. They just haven't had as much experience in person doing this without their parents and other adults hovering over them. Their smartphones keep them awake longer and impact their ability to fall asleep, stay asleep, and get some sufficient continuous sleep and feel well rested. Stress can disrupt their sleep too. So we're dealing with a real sleep deprived, sleep challenge situation. And we know that that's been stereotypical for college students since the beginning of time. And now with smartphones in this generation, with them being in their beds with them, that's even harder. We have a national college health assessment that we administer every other year. And we found that half of our new school students haven't gotten enough sleep to feel well rested at least 5 of the past 7 days. So that's going to impact their ability to show up in your classes and really be able to focus and pay attention. So, you might not think it's necessarily your role to talk to them about sleep, but if they're struggling in your class, or they are, looking holistically at what's going on, or some of the other things going on with this generation. Just thinking about showing up on Zoom and the fact that it might be recorded or that people might take screenshots, in the NCHA, in this survey, what we found is there was a question that asked, within the last 12 months, has their appearance been traumatic or very difficult to handle? When we asked this question of new school students in 2011, 24% said yes, that their appearance had been traumatic or very difficult to handle. In 2019, that was 39%. So just thinking about how they're showing up and whether they choose to display their video and how they're looking, and when we're back in person, again, the way that this is impacting them. They're also struggling financially. 230 unique new school students were using the food pantry pre-COVID in the previous academic year, and we know that our students are struggling even more now. There are so many students who are working 1, 2, or even 3 part-time jobs in addition to going to school full-time to make ends meet, and now many of those jobs have disappeared. So their generational expectations. Let's thinking about, how might these expectations show up in your classes, and what are the challenges and opportunities that you see related to these expectations? So they demand agency, they want some control, while remembering the contradiction that they also don't want the responsibility that goes with it. But thinking as you design your courses, what agency and choice can you build into your course? Can you come up with grading rubrics together? Can you come up with assignments together? You can give them options of the different assignments that they can choose from. You can give them options of something in your course that they can skip. You can, build this in. It can be on an individual basis, or it can be together as the class. So how can you make, with relevance, how can you make your course relevant, especially considering current global events? They expect their classes to be equitable, to have diverse points of view, diverse identities, and to be inclusive. they have the language, they know how to talk about identity. Um, when you're addressing this in your classes, you can be looking at your syllabus, but you can also be looking at just the way that your class plays out. So asynchronous classes can actually be more equitable when you have students who have slow Wi-Fi or coming to class on their cell phone, and there's other folks in the home they're living in working and they don't have as much broadband connection. You can look at making space for all student voices, addressing microaggressions and other bias when they occur, or creating an environment that feels safe and comfortable enough that students can bring it to your attention if you miss it, because they're going to notice things that you don't. And there's going to be things that don't feel good to their generation that you wouldn't think are a big deal because of these generational differences. So how can we set the tone in that way so that that can be brought up? Because if it's not addressed, it can cause some students to to not participate as fully and completely. They expect everything right now. And at the same time, it's completely reasonable for you to have clear boundaries with your time and their expectations. So let's see what else. They are concerned about social justice issues, and a lot of them might be very active right now in terms of protests and action that are going on, and very often can fit the profile of the burnt out activist. So what can you do to build in self-care and community care within your communities, within your classroom? They often, again, feel isolated, right? They're on social media, but they don't feel truly connected to people. So how can you build in more meaningful, more impactful connection so that students are really showing up in ways that are real, that are maybe somewhat vulnerable, that really cut into that learning edge, where they'll be open and learning in the concepts that you're teaching and also in their own personal growth. So moving on, Sheena, to multitasking.
All right, so how many things can you do at once? Let's see, right now I'm drinking coffee and water, and I have 2 laptops out, and I haven't looked at my phone once since we started this call. But I think if you asked your students how many things they could do, they would say 3. Um, some research demonstrates that Gen Zers switch tasks every 19 seconds, with 75% of screens being open for less than a minute and an average of 5 screens at once. So there's a lot of information. I won't even say coming in from different arenas because I'm not sure it's getting in, but there's a lot of information all over the place. And Gen Z really prides themselves on multitasking. They think they can do it. They think they can do it well. And the truth is, no one can multitask. I can't tell you how many times I've met with a student who is on their phone while talking to me and not paying attention to what I'm saying. And I also couldn't tell you how many times I've done that when other people are talking. The truth is, you can do one thing at a time and then you can do something else. So I'm going to share some facts that students need to know. They need to know about how multitasking, smartphone usage, and social media are detrimental to learning, not to mention their well-being and their wellness. So I'll start first with the quote. Multitasking has been found to increase the production of the stress hormone cortisol, as well as the fight or flight hormone adrenaline, which can overstimulate your brain and cause mental fog or scrambled thinking. Multitasking also creates a dopamine addiction feedback loop, effectively rewarding the brain for losing focus and for constantly searching for external stimulation. To make matters worse, the prefrontal cortex has a novelty bias, meaning that attention can be easily hijacked by something new. And that's why when you hear the ding from your email, there's that excitement, even if you know only dreadful things could be coming to your inbox. The irony is that the very brain region you need to use to focus when you're doing competing activities is easily distracted by cute puppies, pings from Instagram, a texted photo of your friend's lunch, And each distraction causes a burst of dopamine that feels good, but reinforces engaging in the distracting activities, which makes it impossible for you to pretty much get back on track. The app designers know this and they want to suck us in. And I think increasingly students are aware of this, but it's important to point it out to them in the moment so they can see in real life and track how the distraction is impacting them. The truth is that our brains are just not wired to multitask well. When people think they're multitasking, they're actually just switching from one task to another very rapidly. And we'll feel like we're getting so much done, but the research demonstrates that multitasking makes us up to 44% less effective. And people who think they can multitask are deluding themselves. A little more on multitasking. So there's some research, even though it's controversial, that suggests that learning information while multitasking, like being online or looking at notifications on your phone, can actually make the information you're trying to learn get stored in the wrong part of your brain, which makes it really hard to retrieve and find again. It's sort of like storing your clothes in the kitchen. That's not where you're going to go look for your clothes when you want to get dressed. Trying to multitask leads to the new information being stored. You know, in March I could remember how to say this word. What is it, Rita? Striatum? Is that right?
Yes, yes,
That's it.
striatum.
Well,
Yes.
so all the information ends up stored there. That's the region of the brain for skills and procedures, and not ideas or facts. And without the distractions, the material could get stored in the right cabinet or in the right place, the hippocampus. And there it's organized, categorized, and you can retrieve it. So when students are studying and listening to music and then their phone dings and they look at it, what they're studying ends up lost, and then it's really hard for them to find it again. So the constant shifting of attention causes the prefrontal cortex and striatum to burn up excessive energy. So this is why you end up feeling exhausted and disoriented. Depleted nutrients lead to cognitive and physiological impairment and increased anxiety. Um, so bottom line is staying on task uses less energy and it's easier. Um, and a good reference point or way to describe it to your students is like your brain, your mind, it works kind of like your phone. If you have all these apps open, the battery's going to run out. But if you just have one app at a time, your phone might make it through the day. And when you're multitasking, you're constantly making decisions about what to do. They're little decisions, but it doesn't matter because small decisions require just as much energy as bigger decisions. And the constant decision making, should I check my email, read this paragraph, check Twitter, write a note about what I just read so I don't forget, so I don't have to read it, or get on Facebook or call my mom. It's overwhelming and exhausting, and it leads to very bad decision making on the bigger decisions that really matter and impact our students' lives more. The average worker is interrupted every 3 minutes. And when you're interrupted, there's some research that shows it takes 23 minutes to get back to where you were. And if you're constantly interrupted, that means you're not ever going to catch up. And in a study, research showed that multitasking reduces productivity. I swear on the last slide, I just said 44%, but by 40%. And so that brings us to our next point. I'm going to hand it over to Rita.
Actually, I think this one's mine.
Oh,
this is Rachel speaking. So we know how people don't learn by being distracted, but how do they actually learn? There have actually been a lot of research into how people learn things within the past 30 years. Research in education, the scholarship of teaching and learning, cognitive neuroscience, and more data-driven assessment and outcomes. So we're beginning to adopt practices supported by what we know to be effective in helping students learn and grow, including how our brains work. The truth is, when we're working to engage and help Generation Z students learn better, what we're doing is actually just good teaching practices that have been proven effective. And Rita often likes to say, whereas in the past with older generations, you could tell them to jump and they'd ask how high, this generation is gonna be like, Why?
I've never said that.
You didn't say that. You said that they would follow instructions.
Yes, but I didn't characterize them as older. And
My apologies. Anyway, so good teaching practices that have been proven effective. Moving to the next slide. One of those are using principles of inclusive teaching. So if you don't feel like you belong, if you don't feel like what you have to contribute is going to be valued, then you're not going to really fully show up with all parts of yourself in that class. And so creating an inclusive climate in your classroom is incredibly important. And we talked about the power of community agreements or discussion agreements to help with that. And there's more as well. Something that we can share with you along with this slide deck is a checklist of inclusive teaching principles and how you may or may not be using those in your classroom. And it's just a personal self-assessment that you can be using, which we think is very helpful. We've also learned, however, that sharing it during a presentation might lead you to multitask and not pay as much attention. So we're going to share that later so that you can hopefully be a little more present right now. Students' feelings of belonging are strongly correlated to academic performance. You don't feel you belong, it's hard to learn. Feeling excluded, marginalized, or devalued in a class can be a significant barrier to students' learning. You can facilitate a sense of academic belonging in your courses through ensuring a broad range of social identities are represented in your syllabus. Use students' preferred names and pronouns, pronounce them correctly. Employ peer learning opportunities. Choose examples from a broad range of cultural domains to illustrate your course concepts and have students provide examples themselves. Students are more likely to persist through challenges when instructors communicate high standards and provide clear paths to success for all students, and when they're transparent about course expectations and norms. This benefits all students, but especially first-generation college students and other groups of students who've been traditionally underserved by higher ed. So just being really clear about what would be effective study strategies, how much time they should be spending on specific assignments, providing grading rubrics that outline clear criteria for success on assignments, sharing examples of past assignments that students in a course, last semester or a few years ago have completed that were really good examples, so they understand what you're looking for. Sharing stories about your own challenges and successes, learning difficult material, that all promotes transparency and inclusion and are things that are especially resonant, not just with this generation, but for all students. Let's see what else. Selecting content for your courses that recognizes diversity and acknowledges barriers to inclusion. So for example, selecting content by authors of diverse backgrounds, considering how much what's represented on your syllabus reflects the standard Western traditional approaches to your course content. Discuss contributions made by historically underrepresented groups. If there haven't been contributions to your field from historically underrepresented groups, acknowledge that and think about why, and think about what can be done to start to shift that within your field. Don't assume as well that all students are going to recognize the cultural references you use, because generationally that can all be very differently. And then with a lot of international students, that can also change. And lastly, self-reflection. While this is listed last, it really comes first. We all need to be aware of our own identities, of what we bring into the room, and even in an asynchronous course, this still resonates. And our own inherent biases. What do we think an ideal student looks like, acts like, says, and does? What does an ideal student work look like? And how are our biases that we may not even be fully aware of impact that? When we do the internal work on ourselves, it becomes apparent, it comes across to our students in the classroom and beyond. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in the next slide, of how we can really make sure that our classes, and I say classroom, but I would say Canvas rooms perhaps, at this point, how they can be anti-racist, because as we said here, and I'm just going to read, saying you don't know how to have the conversation, it's just not acceptable. We can't just call in an expert to facilitate when things go wrong, when there's tension in a class that's due to racial tension or tension related to gender identity or sexual orientation or country of origin or economic status or anything. It is incumbent upon all of us to manage those situations. And it's okay if it's messy. It's okay if it's not perfect. You know, it's hard as the faculty to be vulnerable. That word even.
Wait. I have a question on this. This is, if it's an area of expertise that you don't have, for example, so this is often oversimplified, this issue. And I mean, I love this conversation. Thank you so much, guys. I'm like thrilled to pieces to be here. And it's really, I'm taking notes like crazy. But I do wonder about the complications here when you're talking about someone, for example, with a serious cognitive disability, or you've entered an arena where, let's say, you have a group of people saying that the term TERF is derogatory, and another people group saying no, that's actually that's a legit term. You know, these are like, this stuff is not, this is really nitty gritty stuff. And there is stuff that I mean, I don't know, like I have to consult people, you know, I don't know. I really worry about talking about things I know nothing about. And sometimes it can get super, super micro.
So go ahead, Rachel.
No, go ahead, Rita.
So what I was going to say is the important thing, one, is to acknowledge if something happens and to at least name it. So a microaggression occurs in the classroom, to at least say, wait, even if you're not sure what happened, but to say, wait, I'm uncomfortable. Something just happened. I need to think about this. I wanted to call it out. We'll come back to this in our next class. Even if that's all you do, and then get some more advice and work through what happened. And this is what I heard. This is, what do I do? How do I handle this conversation? Even if it's internal to yourself or speaking to colleagues. So I think that's what we really mean. But when we say, I don't know how to have the conversation, I don't know how to have the conversation.
I think that's a really good approach. I do worry about coming back to specifically this question. The example I'm giving is this word TERP, which is now I can't even remember what it stands for.
I can't remember what it stands for.
Anyway, it's an idea that there's a radical form of feminism that doesn't recognize transgender people as.
Yeah,
so, but the people who are in that position don't consider themselves radical, right? So if there's a transgender person saying, this did happen in a class of mine about 5 years ago, saying, and we were fine, but I worried about it later. So if there's saying, you know, writing from the perspective of a woman, right? And then the radical feminists who don't think of themselves as radical were saying, hold on, before you take that position. We have to talk about that position. So there is no resolution to that question.
You're right. But there is respectful conversation.
But it's not really a screenwriting class, you know? I mean, we got through it okay and talked about it a little bit, but we could have talked about that for 6 hours, you know?
Well, and that's part of this. I like the acronym STOP, which stands for stop, take a breath, observe, and I would say in that naming it and then proceed, and figuring out how you proceed is part of the question. So most of these issues related to bias, I don't know one issue related to bias that has an easy resolution at all. So we're not asking you to solve it or resolve it or make everyone feel happy, but we are saying that we need to acknowledge when things happen in the classroom that are uncomfortable and not ignore it and not just pretend like it didn't happen and we're going to brush it under the rug and keep on going with our agenda, which is exactly what we did right now with you as you brought this up, right? We didn't just shut you down and say, no, we have this presentation to give and we only have so much time. So, you know, we're not going to acknowledge where you're coming from and what you have to say, right? It's like that. What,
Well,
you know,
yeah,
we have a
I
plan.
appreciate it. I don't want to pick on you at all, but this is something that always comes up and seems a little bit unrealistic given how complex some of these issues are.
One other thought that I have, John, is in your community, in your community agreements, because obviously this is not the content of your class. I want to be focusing on the content of my class. But one of your agreements that you could come to with the class as a whole is if something comes up, we will agree to spend we'll agree on how much time we will devote to the conversation.
That's great,
we might
Rita. I
say,
think that's a fantastic solution. Thank you.
Yeah. Any more on this? Anyone else? Okay, Rachel.
So I do appreciate you bringing that up, John. And it comes across in lots of ways, right? Because how you respond when that turf approach or angle comes up, or how you respond, you know, when something unexpected comes, has to do with also the personal work that you've been doing throughout your lifetime. It has to do with your own identities and your own experiences. So actually doing that self-reflection and self-awareness and engagement will have an impact on how you manage these things in your classroom. And it doesn't mean you have to spend an entire class session addressing it. Like Rita said, giving some parameters of how much time is going to be spent on this is one thing. Following up with students outside of class time can be something that may have to happen, especially to keep students engaged if emotions are getting high. But what I'll say kind of to this point is that as we were divvying up the slides and who was going to facilitate this aspect of our workshop today, none of us felt particularly comfortable or confident with this slide. We're like, one of you other folks can do this. But that's exactly the point. We can't be experts on this, anyone, or I mean, there are people who are. There are people, this is their field of academic study, right? But for the majority of us, that's not, but no matter where we are, and we're all in different stages of our personal journey of anti-racism and healing and action, we still have to step up to the plate and engage in this work. So for example, for me, this means understanding and dismantling my white fragility, learning to notice when something problematic happens. And sometimes the problematic thing is silence, or something that isn't said, or something that isn't done. It's not just always these overt things that are said, right? But it's noticing, okay, as an example, I was facilitating these Lang first year groups a decade ago, and I noticed that I went into like 20 different classrooms. It was always the male identified white people who were speaking and dominating the conversations. And it was like a pattern. And eventually when I would go back, I would name that and I would notice that, because that was a problem. Why are these the only voices that are constantly speaking in the classroom? And what can we do to change that? It means assuming responsibility and taking action when something is said that is problematic. And to do that in many aspects of our life, it's going to have an impact that will resonate, including in the classroom. So it also means, for myself, learning to be an empowered upstander, noticing when something happens, assuming responsibility, and then addressing it, knowing how to address it. And if we address it in ways that are a little messy or a little sloppy, we're still addressing it, and we can come back the next class, as Rita said, after consulting with other colleagues, after consulting with friends, after reaching out to us at the faculty center. Your peers have come to us after they've had a class where emotional tensions ran high related to issues of bias, and have wanted to process it with us. And they said, this is what I did, and it was the best that I could do in the moment. And I know that we need to return to it at the beginning of next class for, say, 10 minutes. Can I just bounce some things off of you? You know, for myself, this is also about sometimes stepping back and making space for other people's voices to be heard, for people of color especially, or for other marginalized identities to speak and share and share their experiences and their perspectives. It's noticing who, when I'm teaching again, who's talking, whose voices are not being heard, how my teaching may be perpetuating the ways that I've been taught that may not resonate for people who are historically left out of systems that continue to oppress them. It means in my fields of teaching and expertise, acknowledging systemic racism in my fields and then in bigger systems. But we can often talk about, you know, systemic oppression and think about it as out there without looking at it internally. How is it manifesting in my classroom? Because we can have every single person in the class who's a wonderful person with the best of intentions, and still we're all part of that system. So that's just for me, that you know, it felt messy for me, and I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, this is being recorded and I'm saying these things, and did I say it right, and did it land okay, and what are you all thinking about this? And you know, it's taking a risk doing that, and we have to do that. And so now what we wanted to do was put out to you all to think about a time in your teaching experience when something happened related to race or privilege or some kind of bias or some other uncomfortable moment that occurred. What happened? How did you feel? And how did you handle it? So I also want to ask my co-facilitators, do we want to do a brief breakout for this?
Yeah,
Or do we
I
want to
think
just...
so. I think we have enough people that why don't we do just a what do you think, 5-10 minute breakout? Random breakout rooms?
Yeah, so again, I want to just share the prompts again, and I'll put it in the chat once you're in the breakout. But it's to think about a time in your teaching experience when something happened related to race or some other kind of bias, or some other uncomfortable biased moment occurred. What happened? How did you feel? And how did you handle it? So who's able to...
We had a question?
Yeah, I'm going to want to talk about multitasking. I don't know when the right time will be, but I want to return to that topic.
We are, at the moment, we're slightly ahead of our schedule. Okay. So I'm hoping that we will have time at the end to have discussion.
Okay. I have a question. Rachel,
Yeah.
To kind of slightly change the question, because I'm a Parsons faculty member, but I was also a Parsons student. I mean, granted, basically I've never left the damn place. I've been at Parsons since 1997. So, but,
oh my goodness.
So let's just live it that way. So, but to kind of take a little spin on mine, I would like to bring up like a part of my experience from when I was a student at Parsons.
Sure, absolutely. If that's what resonates with you, please. And I think that's really helpful because...
Sorry.
We're all about allowing agency.
Yes.
Because I think mine is going to come from, I feel like, the unspoken part. That doesn't necessarily, because I teach in fashion and a lot of times race isn't actually addressed in fashion. And so that's why, so for me, there's things that in this moment have kind of drummed up. And I'll just say it's like when I was in fashion about like, how do you illustrate your fashion figures? And granted, we were still taught, you know, to do different races, but it felt like it was still that unspoken, like, oh, you were making a statement by making them black, or were you making them, so that's why, if you kind of sense where I'm going.
Yes,
Okay.
Absolutely.
Sheena, I'm thinking we should just do quick pairs.
Or maybe groups of three?
Okay, groups of three. Okay, groups of 3.
Okay, just a second.
Sorry to put this on you, Sheena.
No worries. I think there will end up being one group that has 4.
That's okay.
That should be fine, right?
Bye, Naoko.
Bye. All right, so we're all set to move into breakout rooms.
Okay.
Assumptions and things that we just
Oh,
Hey, hello?
somehow I left the chat. I'm
Yeah,
so
me too. Me too.
um,
I was like talking
oh,
in the middle. But
Sandra, I'm so sorry. I clicked on a button that I thought was like dismiss, and it
We're now in the main sessions, just so
all
you
right.
know.
Okay.
so I mean, what else? Yeah, and so we can just keep talking here for a minute. I mean, my class this last semester was predominantly female. The makeup of the course was pretty diverse, both in terms of where people came from, their country of origin, as well as racial diversity. I
Yeah.
didn't. Let's see. I did not have any like uncomfortable moments in the class per se. I had the opportunity to take one of these learning sessions before I started teaching. So some of the best practices that they had recommended at the beginning, I guess I tried to put into place. I guess I didn't really think in terms of like, it's interesting what, I'm not saying much. It's interesting what you say about Asian students and the sort of potential cultural barriers to participation. English fluency was not an issue with my students. They were all quite fluent in English, both spoken and written. Although I've been told that I could encounter that, that issue going forward.
Yes.
I did take some advice from other instructors from the class, as well as other peers of mine who are professors. And I didn't let the students break into groups that were natural for them from the outset. I kind of forced them into groups that I felt were diverse, kind of intellectually diverse, culturally diverse, and also based on how I assessed their kind of level of performance and engagement in the class after 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't want to, put all the strongest students together and all the perceived weakest students together. I tried to sort of mix them up a little. I think for me, I sort of stopped thinking about issues of diversity inclusion. I won't say stop, but when we kind of emergency went online, I didn't think as actively about issues of like socioeconomic issues and access to the tools to be online, and because there was a bit more economic diversity in my class, and I think it was obvious to me at first. So that's something that I'm going to be thinking more about as I design my online class this semester, just making sure that it feels very equitable for people regardless of the sort of level of technology that they have access to, I guess.
So it sounds, so I'm gonna, Rachel and Sheena, it's 2:00 and we still have a bunch of slides to get through. So rather than asking the groups to report back, I'm thinking we continue on, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So transparent teaching. I'm gonna do these relatively quickly because I want us to have plenty of time for conversation. So we've talked about transparent teaching. Rachel talked about it a bit. It's telling students why you made the design decisions you did, why you chose one activity over another, letting them into your thinking about why you may have chose among several different options, inviting them to choose among various options, asking them to participate in decisions like what constitutes an A or what constitutes passing work. These are really powerful tools. with your students and really promote learning. Next is mindset. And the idea isn't that you can do anything you set your mind to, but rather having high standards, providing appropriate learning opportunities, believing that your students can accomplish what you want them to do, encouraging their effort, and helping them understand that learning and growth are not dependent on innate talent or intelligence. Carol Dweck, who wrote a book called Mindset, has made a fortune on this very simple concept. The notion is that if you have a fixed mindset, and there's a wonderful graphic that we'll share with you about this, that you can share with your students, that if you have a fixed mindset, it actually inhibits growth and learning because you think you can't do it. Whereas if you have a growth mindset, you think you can do it. And so you try and you try again. There was a huge study of a bunch of fifth graders a few years ago. And the teachers of these fifth grade classes were told that about 3 or 4 students in each of their classes had an exceptionally high IQ. Now, the truth is all the students in the class tested at basically the same level. But by the end of the year, they had done so much better than the other students in the class. Why? Because the teachers expected them to do better, held them to very high standards, expected them to do well, and they did. I mean, it's so simple and yet so powerful. Next slide, metacognition. I developed a whole presentation that's based on metacognition. I talk more about what I was just talking about, fixed and growth mindset. We're running a couple of them in August. This is another one. It's such a simple concept and it is so powerful. It's really asking students to be conscious about their learning. So asking students to ask questions like, how did you go about approaching the assignment? And I don't just mean I read the text online with a note-taking app open so I could jot down reflections and questions, but what room was I in? Was it hot or cold? What chair was I in? And did it help or hinder? Was it so comfortable that I fell asleep? Am I doing my work from bed? And how is that impacting my engagement with the material? What was difficult for me in this lecture? And why might that have been the case? How was I holding my body during the discussion? What would have helped me understand more effectively? What did I do when I noticed my mind had wandered during the lecture? How many times did I check my phone when I was reading that paragraph? This is so powerful and is an inclusive teaching practice. And that last item on the screen, How People Learn, is a free download. It's based on years of research in the science of learning. I would love to talk more about that because I'm just such a fan of the practices of being meta. But we'll move on to contemplative pedagogy. As Sheena said, and Rachel said, our students are, we're all stressed God right now, right? I mean, there are so many invitations to practice, to contemplative practices, to mindfulness practices, to encourage our presence, focus on your breathing. I'm finding myself saying, you know what? Get up and take a walk. We have to remind ourselves to do these things. We really have to encourage our students to practice mindfulness practice and de-stress. One of my favorite, any of you who have come to my Managing the Dynamic workshop, you've done this. I love to, at the beginning of the workshop, say, okay, here's a loose piece of paper. Now take 2 minutes and write down all the stuff that's buzzing around in your brain right now. Or what are you feeling? What are you feeling? Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, now crumple it up And when we're back in person, it'll be so fun to do this, but you can do it even online. Just say, okay, take the piece of paper, crumple it up. And now here I am, make me big on your screen, crumple it up, stand up and throw it at me. It's a contemplative practice. It's a metacognitive practice. It's a physical practice. It encourages movement, and everybody laughs when they hit you in the head. You do it, you can feel the anxiety in the room drop. Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
So active learning, and we did confess that with the amount of material we were sharing with you, in some ways we weren't quite as much practicing what we're preaching here. We did break up and have smaller group-based discussion, and that's an example of active learning. The days of the continuous lecture and likely even the seminar discussion are gone. And personally, I think we need to give our Generation Z students more credit than this, but there are some stats that say that their attention span averages 8 seconds. But truth be told, I don't know about you all, but I am zoomed out and I have trouble focusing and maintaining attention. And I think figuring out what we can do to support that is going to be the most helpful. The way that I would often say this to student leaders when they were developing something that they wanted other students to get engaged in is, think of what you would want to do. Think of what would be the most fun. Think of like just something that you almost think you couldn't do because it's just like too cool or too awesome or like too amazing. Like, can you do that? Can you make that happen? Because, you know, if you as a faculty member are having fun doing something, and your students are hopefully going to be having fun doing it. You know, if you're just thinking about how to just keep their attention and like the slog, I mean, that's just awful. I would say a general good rule of thumb is that for every 60 to 90 minutes of class time, and I know some of you in Parsons have much longer class times than that, you have a 5 to 10 minute break for synchronous teaching. Even for asynchronous, you can employ a lot of these active learning strategies, right? So Canvas discussion can take place asynchronously. Group and team-based activities can take place asynchronously. Making the learning activities experiential and have real-world applications can still happen right now during a shelter in place. You just have to be more creative and think about what would be still kind of fun or engaging, or what do you kind of wish things could be like right now as we're having more limitations than we're accustomed to having, and how can we really be creative around that, even just in terms of having meeting after meeting after meeting. Like, what would be a better meeting to have? Would it be nice to, again, just write for a minute while we're all together and not have to talk and, you know, just focus on what someone's saying? Could there be games involved? And there are ways to play games even asynchronously. So again, thinking about all the different ways that you can employ active learning strategies. You know, we have our summer teaching co-op that's going on, and we invite any of you to join us to, or if you have other colleagues who you touch base with, at this point, regardless, touch base and start to brainstorm. What would be fun for your classes? What could you do? What could be creative? What would engage your students? So moving on. That's Sheena.
Trauma-informed pedagogy. So a lot of the practices and principles we've been discussing collectively can help you create a trauma-informed classroom. I think it's really important to keep in mind that trauma makes it hard to plan, focus, remember, learn, all those things Rachel and Rita have shared. And addressing issues of stress, anxiety, and well-being helps students learn and feel like they belong. So trauma-informed pedagogy is also a part of inclusive teaching principles. And I think rather than, you know, sitting there and trying to guess or assess students individually and trying to figure out what kind of histories of trauma they might bring, what you have to do is just assume that there is a probability of trauma in your classroom and you need to proceed accordingly. It's really vital to communicate often and invite conversation. You can ask students what safety means to them and make sure they know you're really listening to that. And you don't have to promise them safety, but you need to do your part to monitor your classroom and pay attention and speak up and call attention to harm and just show the students you're going to address the difficult things. And I know, earlier we realized that can be a really big deal, and it can be overwhelming, but the important part is for your students to know that you're paying attention and you're not going to let things slide. Be sure, to learn your students' names, use those names, pronounce them correctly, ask them how they're doing. Make sure that they know that you see them and that they matter. And create your classroom with the goal of providing radical hospitality. And that's a space where all of the students are welcomed. You have to build trustworthiness and transparency through connection and communication, and be honest and open. Students, my experience as a student was that I loved it when a faculty member would admit, hey, I don't know, I'm not sure. Let's look it up. Why don't you look it up and talk about it in the next class? You don't have to be an expert on everything. Your students know that you're not perfect. And again, provide structure so that with all of this uncertainty, when students feel probably terrified about everything going on in the world, your class can be somewhere where they know they can look at the syllabus and say, okay, this assignment's always due on Thursday, great. And alongside that structure though, to be truly trauma informed, you've got to provide some flexibility. So maybe I've seen faculty who will say, each semester students, all of the assignments are due on these dates, but students can turn into assignments late. And that way, if something comes up, there's some flexibility and there's some trust established where they're humans and they might have other priorities sometimes, and it doesn't mean the classwork isn't important. Promote collaboration and mutuality. Ask students what matters to them now, what they want to learn, what interests them, and tie that into your course content. Take notes and incorporate their ideas into your communications and instructions. Create a setting conducive to collaboration and sharing of power between students and instructor. It doesn't have to be, I'm the instructor, I know everything, or this top-down approach. It can be you facilitating learning, having a conversation, and empowering the students to speak up so that they can feel like their class is their home. And, when things get challenging, don't be afraid to ask students how you can help them to feel empowered during these difficult times. And the other thing I want to say is it's really important to pay attention to cultural, historical, and gender issues. Use an intersectional lens when you're considering the challenges your students are facing. Get in the habit of, with every teaching practice you implement, asking yourself, who could this leave behind? Or who could get lost in this? And trying to constantly have in mind how accessible this course material is going to be and how inclusive the environment is going to be. Work towards understanding your own default framework and biases related to teaching and learning, and learn about excluded information and practices that have been disregarded historically in your discipline, which Rita mentioned earlier. Make a commitment to learn about and implement accessible and equitable teaching and learning strategies. In our guide to online teaching, we're going to have a lot of, well, you can already view the link, but there will be an entire section devoted to inclusive teaching principles so that you can kind of understand how to do this in an online format. And
Thanks,
yeah, for example, oh, what were you going to say?
No, I'm sorry, I thought you were done.
Okay, almost. One more sentence. Consider an assessment framework that is less focused on grading and more on learning. And I'll turn it over to Rita.
And in our last newsletter, we shared a link to a video presentation by Mays Imad around trauma-informed pedagogy. It was really fantastic. It's 1 hour, and if you have the time, we can send the link again when we send the slides. But it was really, it was quite worthwhile.